Hi, Julia Usher from Recipes for a Sweet Life. Welcome back, everybody. If you saw my Arbor project last week, you'll know it was a doozy with lots of little pieces, many of which I didn't address in that video. In that video, I focused on the assembly of the arbor. Well, today you're in luck because I'm going to show you how to make most of the pieces that you saw on that arbor, with the exception of a few that I've already shown in other videos. So for instance, I will not show today how to make tiny little roses because I have a video on that subject. I won't show how to construct the tiered topiaries because I have another video on that subject. And I won't show how to make these little piped shrubs because I covered those in a castle video that I did over a year ago. However, I will show you many other things. I'm going to show you how to make the brick walkway that was in the arbor. Here I've got brick little tiles. So the brick application can be made in any shape or form. I'm also going to show you how to make sundials on slate, on royal icing slate, if you will. I'm going to show you 4 types of flowers, something that looks like a lupine, which is one of my favorites from my home in Maine, a variation of that that looks like wisteria, so that would be the first set of flowers. I'm going to show you a basic sunflower as the second, and then 2 types of what I call agglomerations, flowers that are constructed of blobs of royal icing and other small things. So I'm going to show you something that looks like hydrangea, and as the 4th flower, something that looks like a geranium, all of which were used on the arbor. And then the last element that I'm going to talk about is how to make some of these tiered pots, these stacked pots that are all made out of cookie and royal icing. So let's get started. I'm going to start with the brick walkway, which is one of my favorite elements of the arbor because it's so darn lifelike. Here's what it looks like completed in brick walkway form. So I've got a slender shape that fits my arbor project, but again, I've got variations of the same technique shown on these hexagon cookies in the foreground. So you can cut your basic cookie any shape. What I'm going to show you today is how to get the textured effect on it, sort of the weathered brick effect, and additionally the little cookie moss that goes in between each of the bricks. We'll start with a cookie that looks something like that. Now, to get to that end point, you'll need a number of things. Some dough, cookie dough, a non-spreading cookie dough. I'm going to be working with my gingerbread shortly, but anything that doesn't spread too much and holds its shape well in the oven is good because you want it to hold the impression we're going to give it with this brick texture mat. Once it's embossed, we're going to cut around it with a custom template. I'm working with a cardboard template here. If I were doing a lot of these projects, I'd probably work with an acetate template that's easier to clean or have a custom cutter made to this shape. But since I only did one big project here, no need to go to that expense or trouble. Then we need some cookie moss. I showed how to make this moss in another video, so I'm not going to show how to make it. It's nothing more than ground graham cracker crumbs that have been tinted with green food coloring, then allowed to dry. And sometimes once they dry, sometimes they stick together and get a little more clumpy, and I'll put them through the food processor again to make them even more fine. I'm going to use a sieve to sieve out the really clunky parts of it so it looks more like fine moss. And then additionally, we'll need some elements to texture the brick on the walkway even before we add the moss to it, namely white food coloring, black food coloring, some sponge brushes to apply the coloring, and optionally a little bit of pearl luster spray just to give it a little bit of sheen and gloss because that just always adds interest and highlights. Kind of reflecting of the sun, if you will. Not that the sun would reflect off bricks, but just adds a little extra pizzazz to the piece. So our first step is creating this embossed dough piece with a brick texture in it. And I take back what I said earlier. I do like to work with gingerbread because it starts out a natural brick color. If you don't have a gingerbread recipe you like, I have a great one, by the way, and the link is in the video description. You can also take regular sugar cookie dough and tint it brown so it looks brick-like. But you want to be starting with a dark color is my point to your dough. And we're going to roll this. I tend to roll it really pretty thin. I'd say this is closer to 1/8 of an inch thick than 3/16 of an inch thick. And I find that the thinner I roll it, the less the dough spreads and the more likely it's to keep really distinct texture. So you want to take the side that has the ridges pointing down, press the mat into the dough, and then roll over it again. to really create a nice firm imprint. Rolling pretty darn hard. And you'll notice I haven't floured the surface too much because I don't want to see flour on the piece when I pull the mat off. Hopefully it'll pull off pretty easily. If not, you can lightly flour it. Ta-da, nice texture. And I'm doing this all directly on a silicone baking mat so that once the piece is cut, I can just move it onto my baking sheet without distorting the piece. That's rather key. You could also do this on parchment paper. Now I want my brick path running the other way, so my bricks are running horizontal and crosswise to my path, so I just rotated my dough for that reason. And then I'm just going to use my little template. And I find that if you can do one straight cut rather than drawing a knife through it, you usually get a cleaner cut. In this case, the piece is short enough that I'm just using my big chef knife and doing one straight down cut on each side. Then once it's cut, remove the pieces. And this then goes on the back of the baking sheet into the oven, bakes my normal baking temperature, 375 degrees Fahrenheit. This is so thin, I might bake it shorter than usual, maybe 5 to 8 minutes instead of 8 to 10, but just watch it. You want it to be lightly browned around the edges, no more than that. So once your dough is baked and cooled down, we're ready to start weathering, if you will, or aging the bricks. That's the first step. So we're going to be taking it from here to something that looks like this. That involves the application of two colors, straight up white and straight up black food coloring, just kind of sponged on. And then we're going to spray over that. One word on white food coloring. Some white food coloring is more tacky and thick than others and will therefore require a longer drying time or maybe even some dehydrating to facilitate its drying before we can fill it with moss. So if you don't have a lot of time to spare, you might want to sponge with a white airbrush coloring, which is going to dry a lot faster than a white gel food coloring or liquid gel food coloring. Though this is going to go down a little bit sheerer, so you might require more applications of airbrush coloring than the gel. I'm going to work with the gel because I've got a piece that's already dried. It's actually more of a liquid color, but so I'm going to start just by sponging on a little bit of white straight up, just kind of smearing it on randomly. The more random it is, almost the better it looks. So I'm using an up and down, a combination of up and down and spreading motions. There's no really right or wrong way to apply this. I just don't really want to see strokes. Okay, that's enough white. And I'm going to come back and put some low lights in the form of black food coloring and some of the other areas. And I've got a fairly little bit on the brush because I don't want it super heavy. You know, I blot it and then I'm blotting a little off before I put it on the cookie. And I can blend in with some of the white if I want to create a grayer shade. Again, random is key here. I think that's all I want to do. I'd let this dry, air dry, until this was no longer really tacky, which might be quite a while, because I use the gloppy Wilton white food coloring that takes a while to dry. Or you could accelerate it in a dehydrator. So I'm just going to shoot it with a little bit of pearl luster spray, just to give it a little bit of sheen. You can wait. In areas where it's wet, the sheen might dissipate, but you can go over it again when it's drier. I just want to show you how this works. PME luster spray goes down really quickly and evenly, which is why I like it. You could also airbrush something like this on. Give it a shake, and then I'm just going to give it a few quick spritzes, if you will. Okay, so I've sprayed it. Now I do need to let it dry completely before I apply the moss, because otherwise the moss will stick to any wet areas. Again, you can accelerate it in a dehydrator or in a low oven if you'd like to do that. So the last step on the brick walkway is to fill it with moss in between the bricks. So we're going to be taking this dried piece from this state to something like this state. And the only reason they look a little bit different in the background is because I weathered them slightly differently in the background. This one has more pearl sheen on top than that one does, and probably more white and black as well. This one's got a little more interest, and this will be the one we'll be filling. Before we do that, I do want to show you the difference between crumbs, though, and what you want to use. So when I made my cookie crumb, and often when I make it, it does clump up because you're adding some alcohol to the food coloring and moistening the crumbs, and so they do stick together. And even after food processing them, they can still be somewhat coarse. So this might be normally how it comes off my food processor. I could try processing it again, but it is a little bit too coarse for the brick walkway because each individual chunk is almost as wide as the opening in the walkway, and I don't want it to look that rough, if you will. So I could process it again, but I think I can get some finer crumb off this if I just sieve some of this into this cup. So this is already a sieved crumb from it is much finer. So I'm just taking the really fine stuff off what I just ground. So I'm going to set it aside, and I like to work over a pan so that if I overflow, which I invariably will, I can catch the extra here and recycle it. Just dump it back in the container when I'm done so I can reuse it. Now I'm going to apply the crumb with a little bit of relatively soft, hopefully it's soft enough, moss-colored royal icing. You don't want it to be too thick because the crumb will bounce right off of it and won't stick to it. And we're going to do it in sections because mine is kind of thick. I'm just going to pipe maybe 2 lines worth at a time and then apply the crumb and then put the rest of the icing down. So a little spoon is perfect for this. Fingers are fine if they're clean. You might pat it in a little bit and then knock off the excess. Oops, I should pipe in the grooves too. But you do want to apply it fast. And I'm not going to press down on it this time because I don't want to flatten it too much. I'm just hoping it sticks of its own accord. I'm just going to continue in that vein all the way down the walk. And in the end, we may once this is dry, take a brush to it and dust off the brick because a little bit of the green haze of the moss has settled onto the brick too, and it kind of hides some of the texture we just created. But we can correct that with a little soft brush in the end. Again, this doesn't have to be perfect. Almost the more rustic it is, the better. And there we have it. So in my previous topiary video, I showed how to make a very basic cylindrical cookie pot. Today I'm going to show you how to make these tiered garden urns, if you will. They really look like a footed garden urn. It's got a little base and a cupped part on top, sometimes 2 cup parts on some of the taller urns. Now to do that, you just need to get creative and look around your house for what forms and molds you have to create these tiny shapes. Basically, for most of the bases on the pots, I just use fluted round cutters to cut flat bases, like so, in various sizes. So a big one and a small one, and I'll have all the dimensions in the video descriptions. For some of my fancier planters that you saw in the Arbor, I used little mini tart pans to actually create the pedestal. In this case, I packed the tart pan on the inside solidly with dough. So this is a solid cookie piece. So different ways to create the bases. Now in terms of creating the forms on top, in most of these cases in front of me, I used various silicone molds. These typically come in big, large sheets. They're for molded desserts or truffles and things like that. And I cut them down into individual pieces for cookie work just because they're easier to handle. So I used this one to create sort of this rough hewn, this is going to look hopefully like a ceramic pot. And to do that, I packed the dough inside of it and then popped it out. And that creates a rougher surface if you cook the dough inside the mold. It'll have kind of a bubbly texture. For these other rounded shapes, namely these cups that sit on top of this big urn, I used different types of silicone molds, more hemispherical and here more conical. And in these cases where the surface is very smooth, I actually wrap the dough around the outside of the mold. You'll notice the inside that was up against the mold is a little less smooth. So if I want a smooth surface, I put the dough on the outside. If I want it rough, I put it on the inside. Lots of different possibilities in terms of pot configurations. The sky is the limit, really. So just think about what you have or go in quest of things that you might not have that could work. If you don't have fancy silicone molds or tart shells, no worries. They can sometimes get expensive. You can often rely on simple kitchen tools for molds as well. So for instance, some of these shapes I molded around the back of a tablespoon and the back of a teaspoon. As long as they're metal and oven proof, because these are going to go in the oven, they'll be fine. Lastly, you'll need a couple of other things in addition to this variety of molds to complete the project. And that is other cookie cutters to cut the dough that we're going to be wrapping around the molds. And then of course some royal icing. I'm going to be using this royal blue of dipping consistency for coating the outsides of the pots, and we'll need white royal icing for the details as well. So I'm just going to quickly show you how I form some of the basic pieces. I distinguished in the intro between pieces that were baked outside the mold versus those baked on the inside, so that's basically what I'm going to show you here. I'm going to start with this pot here, which is baked outside the mold because I want it to be smooth, and the reason I want it to be smooth is because I'm ultimately going to dip it with royal icing to create an effect that looks like a glazed pot, if you will, really smooth glazed pot. So the surface has to start smooth. This particular piece formed the top of this short pot and also the top of this taller pot. But the process for making the bottom part of the pot and also this tiny little pot is basically the same. I just used different molds of different shapes and sizes. But all were formed on the outside of the mold because I wanted the surface to be smooth. So I'm just starting with my gingerbread. Again, any kind of dough that doesn't spread much and crack in the heat of the oven is good because this is going to be baking on a sloped surface, and I'm going to roll it rather thin. The key thing is I do need to get it off the surface, so I need to make sure I can disengage it at all parts of the rolling process, and I think that looks pretty good. Just going to put my glasses on for this so I can really see what I'm doing. And this is where the round cutters come in handy. You need to choose a round cutter that's bigger than your mold because you're going to need a piece that's long enough to drape down the sides. I think this one's probably too big. This one's probably amply sized, so I'm going to use that one. And I've got a little cracking on the top of my dough, which sometimes if I just rub in flour, that tends to disappear. And we're just going to cut a piece. If that's too small, we'll just have a short pot, but the process will be the same. So I drape it over my mold and then just work it down the side. So this is going to create a shallow pot. Actually, if I had probably used this cutter, it would have come all the way down to there, which is closer to what I did to create this form. But the process is the same. Just gently form it around the outside, and then that's going to go on my baking sheet and into the oven. But before it goes in there, I want to show you how to create one other type of pot that's molded on the inside. So for instance, this one looks a little rough. It looks more like maybe cast concrete or stone pot, which could look great in a rustic garden. And to create that effect, I wanted a rough surface, so I needed to create a surface that looks something like this. And wherever the dough bakes against something, on the bottom side of the dough, it's going to be a little bit rougher. So in this case, I do want to pack the dough on the inside of this long mold. And in this case, I don't bother to roll it out thin. I usually just pack it into the pot and work it down in there and up the sides. So this might be a rather thick piece of cookie dough, but that's okay. So I'd work it in like so. If I want a really tall pot, the whole height of this, I'll work it all the way up the sides. If I want it somewhat shorter, I can put in less dough and just work it halfway up the sides. And we'll not worry about rough, uneven edges quite yet because they can always be filed afterwards, after they've baked. So that looks pretty good. And that would simply go into the oven like so. And both would bake. This one will probably bake faster simply because there's less dough in it, maybe 8 to 10 minutes. This one might take a little bit longer to bake all the way through, but just keep an eye on them. As long as they're lightly browned around the edges when they come out, they should be just fine. I let them cool slightly on the mold when they come out of the oven, and then as soon as I can handle them, I pop them off the molds to cool completely. So now we want to get these pots that we just baked covered with coloring in some way, and I'm going to show you a treatment for getting a smooth coat and also a treatment for getting that rough stone sort of effect. Let's start with the smooth urn first. This is the piece that's baked, now completely cooled. I'm going to dip this, and you've seen me dip in other videos, so I'm going to do this pretty quickly. But before I dip it, I do like to file it so that any unevenness here is corrected. If you're eating this piece, please use a food grade tool like a microplaner. Just run it across the surface until this is pretty even. You'll probably have to file it again after dipping, but if you file first, it eliminates the amount of filing that you have to do later. It minimizes it, rather. Or if you're not going to be eating these, then sanding paper is a little more efficient. It goes a little more quickly. I've got it sanded evenly, as you can see. Just want to dust off those extra crumbs. And now I've set up a little dipping area. I've got a little plastic lid here that's going to contain any excess icing because I'm going to be plunging this in icing and letting it pour off. And I've got a little lift that I'm going to set it on. Once I've dipped it, this just allows the icing to freely drain and prevents a foot of icing from forming at the bottom that we would then have to file off later. Now for dipping, I use icing of dipping consistency, which is very close to my beadwork consistency, about 2 to 3 teaspoons of water into every cup of my royal icing glue. So for dipping head first into the icing needs to be of sufficient depth that the cookie doesn't hit the bottom of the container, or you'll get a big hole on the top of the icing, a big bubble there where it hits the bottom of the container. Now, I see a few big air bubbles while the icing is still wet. I do want to pop those out. I want to do that pretty quickly so if I wait too long, it'll leave a dent or a hole. Got one on the other side. I've got a teeny one here. But otherwise, it's pretty nice. Okay, now I'm ready to set it down for draining on my little stand. I'm going to clean my hands and I'm going to quickly come back and also clean up the bottom edge with my trussing needle. So again, before the icing has an opportunity to set, I come in with my trussing needle and just kind of wipe off the excess icing and try to get that bottom edge as straight as possible. I'm sort of actually pushing the trussing needle in rather than dragging it side to side. I find I get a cleaner edge that way. So I'm kind of pushing it in and then pulling my trussing needle out from underneath. And just continue in this vein. You don't want to go too long doing this. When you start putting cracks into the icing's too dry for you to continue doing this, and you just stop. But this will neaten up the edge and require you to do less filing and cleanup of that edge once it's dry. So I'm going to set the dip pot aside to dry. Ideally, I'd dry it for several hours, if not overnight, before we start detailing it and assembling it. In the meantime, I just want to show you how to create more of this rough-hewn stone type texture. My underlying cookie is dark. I'm just going to whitewash it with white food coloring. If you had a different underlying cookie color, you might consider different colors on top, maybe a combination of white and gray, but I think white will just be fine. So this one's completely whitewashed already. Here's the one that I baked earlier. I filed down the top a little bit, but it's not perfectly even. I wanted to leave it looking kind of rough and chipped at the top. So I think that's good enough for this rustic pot. And for sponging purposes, just again, this is straight up white liquid gel food coloring, saturating my sponge brush and just spreading it around. And we want to see all that irregularity. It just kind of heightens the bubbles and cracks and things like that. You can use either an up and down motion or a spreading motion. There's, again, no real right or wrong way. And I think I'm just going to leave it like so and let it dry. And it creates kind of a really rustic type pot. So now that this is dry, our next step is getting these fun little swags and patterns on these. I want these to look like really elegant urns. Here's a gray on gray version, which I think is quite stately as well. This is one I'm going to be putting together a little bit later. But I'm going to complete this one in white, just as I did this smaller piece, or very similar to this smaller piece. Just lay some swags and some dot work. Now before we do that, again, we probably want to clean up this edge with a little bit of filing. I'm going to use sanding paper, but if I were going to be eating this, I'd be using my microplaner, which is a food-safe tool. Sanding paper is not. Yeah, I think that's flat enough for our purposes. Okay, so the first step is marking quadrants here because I'm going to have 4 swags on this pot, and I'm using my outlining consistency icing for this part of the process. So to do the swags, once it's all marked off, you want to make contact with one of your markings and then let the icing basically free fall into a swag without touching the cup, and then make a second contact point at the other end. And you'll get a smoother arc that way. Now in doing successive swags, it's important to keep an eye on how deep you're letting that swag drop. You want to make sure they're all roughly dropped to the same depth. The pot will just look more symmetrical that way. Now I've turned it over and elevated it onto a styrofoam so that I can have better visibility into this next set of details. Here I'm doing a trailing beaded border, same icing, just pushing forward to create a bead and pulling back to create kind of this zigzag effect. And I'm going to repeat it on each side of each swag. Push forward, pull back, release pressure, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back. I want to create a dangling element between the center here. It's the same motion, but I'm going to be creating beads to either side of a central line. So pushing off to the left, then off to the right, off to the left, and so on and so forth. And we're going to repeat that at each little convergence of swags. So I've changed to a looser icing, my beadwork consistency, to do a little dot work while this is still upside down. And then we're going to let it dry completely. I'm going to turn it right side up and we're going to do some detailing around the upper edge of the lid as you see here. Or at least I'll explain to you how to do that. As a reminder, that beadwork consistency is one such that the icing droplet forms a nice rounded shape on its own without any peak. I usually add about 2 to 3 teaspoons of water to my royal icing glue to get it that consistency. You'll also note I'm working really close to the edge of the styrofoam, and that's just so I don't have to reach in too far to the piece and I have a little bit more control in my piping. So I'm constantly rotating it to get the area I'm working on closer to the edge. We'll just do dots all the way around in a couple of different areas. I love dots. So that completes the bottom detail that I want on this. So I'm going to set that aside to dry completely. And when it is, we can turn it over, place it back in a little support, and then pipe lines and dots along the upper edge as I did on this particular piece. For the lines, I use outlining consistency. For the dots, I'll use the same beadwork consistency. Then let it completely dry and we're ready to assemble it. Here's the same gray on gray. You can see the little edge work I did at the top. I'm not too worried about getting this edge super clean because when we fill the pot with dirt, as you'll see in the very last step when we put a pot together, I'll cover that up. Just the outer edge is what I'm focused on here. So now I'm going to put the pot together. The pieces are all completely dried. Just to reorient you, this is very similar to the piece that I just did in blue and white, decorated with the same sorts of swags. I have another smaller cone that was created using that conical mold I showed you earlier, and I use the same techniques, line work and dot work, to create a slightly different pattern on this one. And then the simple base, I whitewashed the edges with food coloring, just like we sponged the pot earlier. Straight up white food coloring, a little bit of top coat of gray icing, and a little bit of beadwork, and that's going to be the very, very base. And I would put it together something like so. So it looks something like this one, but in gray. And to do that, all I need is a little bit of gray fondant and some thick gray royal icing, basically the colors to match whatever the pot color is. Because if a little sticks out, you're less likely to see it. The fondant just gives these pots, because they're very pointed on the bottom, a little something to nestle into and keeps them a little bit steadier. We just don't want that much popping out. So I've got my thick gray icing here, very, very thick. The thicker it is, the faster it dries and the more stable this will be. But I'm going to try to use as little as possible. So just a little blob there and a teeny blob of fondant. Centered. Then a little bit of icing on top of that to secure it to the fondant. And then we plunge it in as centered as possible on the disc. And you can see because of the fondant, it's steady pretty much right away. You just want to make sure before it dries that it's centered front to back and side to side and not really leaning too much. There's going to be a little bit of imperfection to these because they are cookies after all, but I think that looks pretty good. And I think, I could give this a little drying time, but since we're in video time, I'm going to try to stack it immediately and hopefully it'll stay together. I needed more fondant in it this time so it makes contact with the bottom. Or a lot of icing, either or, because this is a deep receptacle. So I'm going to start with a bunch of icing in the bottom. Maybe a little bit of a bigger blob of fondant to kind of extend the icing. And then more icing on top. And then we'll just sink this one into it as well. I'm going to try to line up patterns. I think I want this little drooping swag to be in the middle of the swag over here rather than lined up. And I'm just going to hold the bottom piece a little bit steady as I press it in because it's not dry yet. Oopsie, that's not very straight, is it? Well, I think what I'm going to do is just rotate it around until it sits as flush to the other one as possible, which means that my swags are now actually lined up, but that's okay. So that's it. I just got it straightened, and then if you need to, you can prop it with a cookie cutter or some other container if it is leaning, which mine is a little bit, until it's completely dry. And we'll let it sit for about, I'd say at least an hour before we fill it with other flowers and things which you're going to be making a little bit further along. Moving on to my favorite little detail on the arbor. I think it's my favorite detail, and that is the sundial that's sitting on a piece of slate. I also use slate to form little walkways and little landing pads in my arbor scene. So I'm going to show you both how to make the sundial and the slate. Here's an example of one assembled. What you'll need for this, not much. A little bit of gold fondant or modeling chocolate, a clock-shaped rubber stamp, a little black liquid gel food coloring, and a foam ink pad. We're going to be distributing the coloring on the pad and stamping that stamp pattern onto the fondant. You'll also need a little round cutter to cut out the stamped fondant. I'll have all the dimensions in the video description. And then lastly, we need a few things to add a little sheen to my sundial. You'll notice that the top looks a little bit golden, not so yellow. And some of the tiny little dots and things around the edges are also gilded. And I used two different mediums for that. I first used PME gold spray to spray the entire top of the clock face. And then I came in and I painted the little dots and details with an extension of gold powder. This is a gold highlighter dust, Rolcom Gold, extended with a little bit of alcohol to turn it into a paint, and I sponged that on. And I'm going to take you through all these steps now, starting first with the stamping on the fondant. The first step is to roll out some gold fondant. I'm going to roll this to my usual thickness of 1/16 of an inch, which is the number 3 setting on my pasta machine. And now we're ready to stamp on it. If your surface is at all tacky, you might lightly dust it with powdered sugar, just so your stamp doesn't stick to the fondant. And I'm going to be stamping, of course, with food coloring, my liquid gel food coloring applied to a foam ink pad that originally had no food coloring or any coloring of any kind on it. But I've used it for black before, which is why it's black. I'm going to apply some additional coloring just to moisten it and blot off all the excess. If you have too much food coloring on there, you'll get a blobby looking stamp. So I'm basically blotting this down so the pad just looks damp, not wet, with no big blobs of coloring on it. And then stamping as you would stamp anything else. The stamp source will be in the video description, pressing uniformly on the top of my acetate block, and voila. The next step is to cut it out, and I'm using the blunt end actually of a 7/8 inch cutter because it's closer to the size of my particular stamp. I might need to trim up the edge a little bit if it's a little bit rough, but it looks pretty good. And set it aside to dry. We want it to be completely firm for assembly. I want to cut some of this orange color and make it look more gold, so I'm going to spray it with the PME luster spray. Usually I'll do this under a hood because it goes everywhere. Give it a good shake. And a couple good spritzes. So now we're focused on the little arm on the sundial. And that's nothing more than a royal icing transfer, meaning I pipe royal icing on another surface and transfer it off once it's dry and onto this little fondant piece or onto a cookie if I were putting it on a cookie. Now I want to make sure all my little dials are the same height, so I've created some guidelines, drawn them on parchment paper, and stuck them down onto a cardboard with a little bit of shortening. When I'm doing very delicate transfers, I like to work on parchment paper because the pieces, once they dry, will literally pop off. In some cases, I use acetate underneath, which I'll do when I make the slate, because it creates a shiny effect, but it's much less pliable. And delicate pieces are harder to get off acetate. So I'm using parchment here for a very big and good reason. And I've got an outlining consistency icing. I want this very delicate. So I'm going to just start by piping a triangle. And then some lines radiating from one corner of the triangle to the long side of the triangle. And this is super delicate. I might open it up a touch when I do a second or third one. But that's the general idea. I'm making them slightly less than 1/4 of an inch deep that way. And there may be 3/8 of an inch in this direction is my guess, but I'll have all the dimensions in the video description. So do as many as you'd like, set them aside to dry. These, because they're so delicate and the icing's so thick, they won't take very long. It could be less than half an hour. And when they're ready to come off, you'll know because they will literally pop off the parchment paper like so. So now we're ready to put that in one of the sundials that we previously stamped. And these sundials are now dry. Well, you'll notice about this one here, it's been sprayed, but I also added some little brown, or rather black dots around the edge using not outlining icing, but rather that loosened up to a beadwork consistency, just for a touch more detail. I'm going to take that outlining icing again and use it as glue to put one of these little arms in place, if you will, with just a touch of icing in the center, because I don't really want to see it. And that should be enough to hold it in place if I don't break this before I put it down. And you just want to get it standing upright. And you're good to go. And the last detail is adding some gilding to the dots, but I do want this arm to dry a little bit in place before I do that, so that it doesn't flop over when I gild these little dots. So in addition to spraying the cookies with gold earlier, we're adding another form of gold highlighting, which is extended gold highlighter dust. I've added a little alcohol to turn powdered gold into paint, and I'm just going to sponge it on these little dots I have on the side. The dots now, of course, are completely dry. And I like to sponge on as perpendicularly to the surface as possible so that I don't get gold on the clock itself, just on the beads. So you'll notice I'm sponging from the side. We'll just go all the way around. And then if you'd like to sponge the sundial arm itself, you can. On some of my sundials, I had additional beads there, but just gilding the entire side of the arm looks nice too. Now, we're ready to mount it on pieces of slate. These are also transfers. I'm going to talk about how to make these in a second. So I just want to mount that on there, and to do that, so it's sitting elevated like this guy, I take a teeny bit of fondant, some gray icing, clean up any extra icing that's showing. And then perch it on there, like so. Kind of at an angle. So you can either have them up on slate or flat. So the slate, how did I do that? As I said, they're just a royal icing transfer, but this time I'm using acetate. When I'm doing a long, big piece of something, I generally like to use acetate as opposed to parchment paper because it's less likely to buckle and curl through the drying process. And I want this to keep flat, and I'm going to do one big piece of gray icing on here and then break it up to form these little chips. So acetate here. The other benefit of acetate is it gives me a shiny side, which I sometimes like to put forward. Here's the shiny side. You can see it's a little bit reflective. But the downside is it'll take longer to dry on acetate than on parchment paper. There's less air breathing through the acetate than there is through parchment paper. So I like to do the slate about a week before I need to use it to make sure it completely dries. And for that I'm using a relatively loose gray icing, something close to a thick flooding consistency. It kind of plops off the spoon. You don't want it so thin because it'll take then forever to dry on the acetate, but you want it thin enough that it actually ends up settling pretty flat once I spread it on here. So I'm just going to spread it onto the acetate lined board, and I'm going to mix in a little bit of, got a little dry piece in there we want to get out. I'm going to mix in a little bit of darker gray or black just to give it a little bit of interest. You could pipe this on, but I'm just going to spread it around. So we'll have kind of a two-tone effect. The less you spread it, the less it's mixed together. Now I've got some texture on mine because my icing's a little bit thick. If I shake it, it'll flatten some of that out. But I think having some texture on top is okay because these are supposed to look like kind of rough-hewn slate. Now you set that aside to dry, and again, I like to do that long time ahead. Once you've done that and it's dried, you'll notice it too peels rather easily off the acetate, leaving you with one very shiny side and one dull side. And then I simply just break this up at random to create the little slate pieces for my walk. Whoops. Again, not a problem because we're going for irregularity here. But to get more control over where you break them, it's best to have a smaller piece to start with, and then to focus your fingers where you want to crack it. So you'll notice my thumbs are both there because that's where I want to crack the piece, and I got a pretty decent crack there. So we'll just do up a bunch of those to create pathways for our arbor. So now we come to the segment of the video which is really the icing on the cake, or the cookie if you will, all of the flowers that went on the arbor. I have so many different types. I'm going to show you most of them. I'm not going to show you the mini little roses or the little daisies that sit along the garden path because I show those in 2 other videos. What I am going to show you are 2 types of flowers that I call agglomerations, meaning they're blobs of royal icing agglomerated with either nonpareils or sugar confetti to create different types of flowers. So for instance, I'm going to show you how to make something that resembles geraniums by creating an agglomeration with the sugar confetti. I'm going to show you something that resembles little hydrangea blobs by agglomerating blue royal icing with a mixture of 3 different shades of nonpareils, a bright blue, a light blue, and sort of a lavender pink. So those are the 2 agglomeration flowers. Likewise, I'm going to show you 2 piped flowers and a variation of one of the second flowers. So I'm going to show you a simple sunflower or daisy. Well, sunflower, because I have a different type of daisy that I'm not going to show you. So I'm going to show you this orangey yellow sunflower, which is piped with a leaf tip. I'm also going to show you this little bundle of flowers, which I'm calling them lupine. Some people thought they were lavender when I posted some work in process to the internet, but they're lupine. They're a flower I love that grows in Maine. I'm going to show you how to create those. They're both piped and airbrushed for shading. And then lastly, I'll just talk you through how I made the wisteria that hangs off the side of the arbor. It's just a variation of the lupine, different undercolor of icing and slightly different colors on top. So I'll just talk that through because it's a quick variation of the other flower. So to make these flowers, you'll need various shades of royal icing, which I don't have on the table. You'll need a red or a pink for the geraniums, a light blue for the hydrangea, a sunny golden yellow, which will be a mixture of golden yellow, brown, and a little bit of red for the sunflowers, a wedgwood blue for the lupine, and a white undercolor, just untinted icing for the wisteria. You'll also need the confetti and the nonpareils I spoke of, some black sanding sugar for the centers of the sunflowers, and a number of parchment covered boards because these are all royal icing transfers. Parchment or acetate covered boards, either will work with these particular small pieces. I've got parchment covered boards here. They've just been stuck down so the parchment lays flat with a little bit of shortening. So we're ready to get piping. I'm going to start with the really simple flowers, which are the agglomerations or the blobs. I'm going to start first with the little hydrangea. As a reminder, this is what one of the blobs is going to look like, and we're going to piece them all together to create a little hydrangea shrub, if you will, similar to that at the very end. And for this, for the underlying icing, I'm using that Wedgwood blue I spoke of, but it's kind of a loose outlining consistency. It just plops off the spoon. I want it sufficiently damp that the nonpareils cling to it without bouncing off, but I don't want it so loose that when the nonpareils hit it, it flattens it completely. I want it to hold its shape. So this is the consistency we're going for. It kind of plops off the spoon. And I'm going to do a few at a time and then pour the nonpareils over them and catch them in this underlying cookie sheet so I can recycle the nonpareils, because you'll see I get a lot of overflow. I don't want to pipe a bunch and then pour the nonpareils, because by the time I get to the last one, the icing will probably be dry and the nonpareils will bounce off of it. So I usually do 3 or 4 at a time, sprinkle the nonpareils, and then continue down the line. And again, I'm working on parchment papered lined cardboard, and you can just sprinkle generously, because we're just going to be able to harvest everything off this cookie sheet when we're done. So you can see the assortment of colors makes these look sort of lifelike. This is going to be very miniature. It's about a 1-inch little shrub we're doing. So we'll just continue and make a bunch more. For a little shrub like that, I might have 20 pieces on it. And I've got some pre-made. These, once done, you just set these aside to dry. Because the icing is relatively thick, these should pop off in a few hours, but to be on the safe side, I'd give them overnight. Now, same process for what I'm calling geraniums. These are going to go on the window box, or rather they went in the window box on my Arbor project already. Here's one that's red on red, red underlying icing, red sugar confetti. You can do pink ones with red underlying icing and pink on top for a little more interest. Here I've done red on red, but I sprayed them with a little bit of pearl PME spray, similar to the gold we used earlier, but pearl to give them a little bit of shine and a little bit of dimensionality. And here's another version where I have a red underlying icing and a mixture of pink and red on top. And we're going to be actually doing this version here. So lots of possibility here. You can mix those up and they look a little more natural when they get into a collection, when they're not all the same. So to do that same exact process, just piping random blobs. Here I might make them slightly different shapes, not all round. And I'm using the same consistency red icing as I had the blue. Ideally, I do these on a separate tray. These are still wet and I don't want the red pieces to stick to the blue pieces. So I'll try to be a little bit careful here. And again, just working at a few at a time, generously covering with sugar confetti. And then dropping it off. These will appear much bigger because the sugar confetti pieces are bigger than the nonpareils. So for the same size blob, you're going to end up with a much bigger flower. So now I'm going to talk about how I made these little stand-up lupine. You see them lining the fence, the bottom of my fence in my Arbor project. So they're completely three-dimensional. I start by piping this leaf base, and for that, I'm using a relatively thick moss green icing, and I believe a number 349 tip. I want this to be pretty delicate. Again, these are transfers, so I'm doing them on my parchment paper lined cardboard. And I'm just going to pipe 4 or 5 leaves around to form the base. I'm leaving a little hole in the center to receive the flowers once they're piped and dry. It'll just be easier to assemble if there's a little opening in the middle. So that's the basic process. Those are pretty straight leaves. You could do more variegated leaves by pulling in and pushing back. So I'm kind of moving my pastry bag as I'm piping, and it creates a little more texture to the leaf. So lots of possibilities here for leaf shape and variety. Now this piece was done earlier. You notice it just popped right off the parchment paper. You might also notice there's a two-tone quality to it. It's sort of moss green underneath and there are highlights of darker green. That's because I airbrushed it with a dark green, leaf green later. Just shot it kind of randomly with an airbrush. You could also dust it with a green petal dust for same or similar effect, just to give it a little more dimension. But you want to do that after it's dry completely. So I'm just going to set that aside. I'm going to use the other half to show you how I created the flowers. I start first with the blue icing, relatively thick. It's close to my outlining consistency. I want it to hold its shape, and I've got it in a parchment cone. This is basically a variation of my trailing beaded border that I do in a lot of cookies, where I push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back. But I'm going to do that a few times. I'm going to do one side that way, another side, and then connect them down the center. It's going to be kind of 3 repetitions of that to form one flower, if you will. So I start by creating my central bead forward, pull back, push sideways, pull back, and make these varying lengths. You don't want them all the same height because you want your garden to look natural. So I've got one side of the flower. I'm going to come back and do the other side. Same motion, pushing out, pulling back, pushing out, pulling back, pushing out, pulling back, pushing out, pulling back. And you'll see there's kind of a seam down the middle, which I want to conceal. So I'm going to come right back over it and do the same motion, but straight down. Push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back, push forward, pull back. So we'll do one more of those. Starting at the top, then off to the side. And after you get in a rhythm, they go pretty fast. Then off to the other side, connecting in the center as best you can. And then straight down the middle to hide the seam. You could give this a little drying time. If your icing's loose and you run over the top with the other seam, you can kind of disrupt the structure of the underlying piping. But my icing did pretty well the last time I did it, so I'm going to go immediately over it. Just being careful not to drag my tip into what's underneath. So those are the basic flowers. Now you might say, well, how did they come to look like this? Or how did they come to look like this? Or this? All of these have various degrees of shading on them. Well, I took out my airbrush. I'm quite an airbrush fan because I've got a new airbrush that I'm working on and I hope to launch later this fall. So I've been testing it quite a lot in many different applications, not just with stencils. So in this case, I took pink coloring and shot one side of the lupine with it. Then I came in and tried to hit the other side on some of them with dark purple. So I had 2 different colors I was working with, pink and dark purple. Applied to the blue, the pink becomes a little purpley. And I shot them from different sides and different angles so that no 2 would look alike. Some have 2 colors, some have 1 color, some have more color on one side than the other side, etc. So now how did I put it all together? I'm back to one of the dried leaf bundles that I did earlier. I'm just going to move forward. These aren't dry enough to work with, but once they're dry, you can see they come right up. And I'm going to go back to that leaf green icing that I had. Hopefully it's thick enough to serve as glue. And I'm just going to pop a little bit in the center. And take some of these pieces. Now, if I did these on acetate, they don't always pop off immediately. They stick a little bit more, but you can see they come off with just a gentle tug. So I'm going to take some of these. Usually I arrange 3 or 4 in one little bundle of different heights. And again, some irregularity is good. I give it a little bit of drying time, or use a slightly thicker icing here so they don't lean, and then when they're set, come back in and pipe a few more leaves up and around the bottom to cover the blob of icing that was serving as glue. So I'm going to show you one flower variation of this, the wisteria. Just talk it through because it's basically the same process. They're nothing more than a white icing underneath piped the same way, except that I have, instead of maybe 3 of those beaded lines, I've got 4 on each one, and I've piped them with somewhat of an arc, so when they hang, they're looking like little bundles of drooping wisteria. Here I shot them with a combination of purple and pink to create this shading effect. And again, rather randomly, so every piece looks like it's shaded a little bit differently. So we're on to the last pipe flower, which is this mini sunflower. This is just the head here. This is where we're going in terms of the flower itself. But by the end of this little demonstration, I'll show you how to assemble it all completely together to create little bouquets, if you will. These will be growing three-dimensional stemmed flowers that will stand at the base of the arbor near the fence. So let's start with the head, though. Again, royal icing transfer, so I'm working on a parchment paper lined cardboard, and I've got a small number 349 tip in that sunflower yellow in here, and I'm just going to do about 5 or 6 small petals radiating out from the center, just pushing a little more forcefully here and then releasing pressure as I pull back to create a little peak on the petal. The icing is relatively thick to hold its shape, and so that the petals don't blend into each other. If they're blending into each other as you're piping, then just thicken up the icing a little bit. It's probably a little too loose. Oops, that's not exactly symmetrical, but some irregularity is fine. Again, we're trying to mimic nature, and nature isn't always perfect. We'll do one more. I think I fit 6 petals around that. Sometimes I get 7. And that petals are super long. You just want to make sure they're all connecting at the bases, because once they're dry, if they're not connecting around that center little ring, then it won't pull off in one piece. So once again, these have to dry completely before we can do any highlighting or even apply the centers to them. So since these are wet, I'm just going to talk through what I did to get them from A to Z. I let them dry completely till they popped off the parchment paper. Then I dusted the petals with a little bit of petal dust. This is a compressed petal dust, not powdered form. So I like to mess it up a little bit on the block itself with a dry brush. When I say dusting, I'm dusting dry powder with a dry brush typically. And then I just dusted it into the interior of the flower. Here I'm getting a little more of the leaves just because the center is already in this flower. But typically I dust first. You can also dust afterwards if you want the petal having more highlights on the outer part of the leaves. And then to create the centers, I did basically a mini agglomeration. You saw how I did the hydrangeas and the geraniums earlier. I just piped a teeny bit of brown food coloring in there once the leaves were dry, and then dropped this black sanding sugar on top of it and dumped it out. But you don't want to do this now, or that black sugar will stick to everything. So that's the basic flower. Now comes the interesting part of putting it together into little stalks, if you will. To do that, I first created some royal icing stems. Again, these are transfers, just using a dark green icing and piping a straight line, more or less. So I like to put these together flat as a transfer rather than trying to assemble them dimensionally as I'm putting together the arbor, because there's going to be a tendency for these very delicate pieces to want to fall over. So it's best to stick them all together flat and then stick the whole structure up together next to the arbor. So we're just doing that very first step here. So I'm just going to take some green icing. I've got my moss green leaf icing we used for the other flowers. You could also use a dark green icing. It doesn't really matter. And I'm just going to stick these all together at the base with a blob of icing, or hope to stick them together without breaking them. You don't want to press them very hard because you'll break them. You're kind of sliding them into place. I broke that piece, but that's okay. Now to cover that blob, I've got some pre-piped leaf bundles. These were piped much the same way as I piped the little circular ring of leaves for the lupine, except I didn't pipe these in a circle. I just piped a few straight up. And I'm going to use that to conceal the blob of icing underneath, not pressing too hard. And then we're very carefully going to attach a dried sunflower to each end here. And then once it's completely dry, we should be able to pick it all up. For attaching the sunflower, I want to use my yellow icing, I think, with a smaller tip, and so that I don't apply undue pressure on the end of that very delicate grass, I'm going to apply the icing to the back of the flower and then just gently rest it on the top of the grass, or stem rather. And just get it oriented exactly as you want it to appear, because that's exactly how it's going to dry. So once it's dry, you'll end up with a piece that looks just like this, very three-dimensional. Still very delicate though, so be very careful. I like to keep them stored on soft paper towel as opposed to on a hard plate, just so we don't snap those stems. So we've done flowers of different types. We've made brick walkways, we've made pieces of slate, we've made sundials, we've made urns. I'm going to show you now how to put that all together into a quick small cookie. You can of course put all these pieces together in a much more elaborate configuration like my arbor, which you should check out if you haven't seen that previous video. But if you don't have the time for that, any of these elements I've done can be put together in a much smaller format on a single cookie. And I'm going to just show you one quick assembly of a hydrangea shrub on a brick walkway. So let's put a little hydrangea shrub together, shall we? Here's what we're aiming for. I've got a slightly bigger pot here. I did have that urn, the blue version of the urn we put together earlier, but I thought it was too big to contain this hydrangea shrub. Even this smaller one probably is. So we'll opt for this particular configuration and see how that ends up looking. The process though, whether I use a big urn or a small urn, the assembly process is very much the same. Now I have a little topiary globe that's covered with cookie moss. I showed in my other topiary video how to do this, so I'm not going to repeat that here. This is fully dry. It's mounted on a little bit of a bamboo skewer, and I'm simply going to put a blob of fondant. You could use modeling chocolate, which is a little more tasty, as a receiving area for it. Before we glue that in place, I want to make sure that it looks like it's a dirt, covered pot, that there's some dirt in the pot. So to do that, I'm using a loose outlining consistency icing, something that has body, but again, is loose enough that it's going to grab those crumbs without them bouncing off. Similar to the consistency used for those agglomeration cookies. And I've got some ground chocolate cookies. I'm going to do this over the container and dump on a bunch. I'm going to just dump off the excess. And you might want to get a little pastry brush and dust up any dust that gets down into the white area as well, or a small paintbrush that's dry to clean that up a little bit. Yeah, that looks a little neater. And now we're ready to glue the globe in place. For that, I like to use a slightly thicker icing, so I'm going to go back to that leaf green that I was using earlier, which is a little bit thicker, and just put a little bit on the stem here, on the skewer, and then plunge that into that fondant while it's still soft. You could use brown here too. It'd be maybe less likely to show, but I'd prefer to use a thicker brown if I were going to use brown. So there we've got our shrub in place. I'd like to have a slightly bigger shrub in that big pot, but we're going to be adding some hydrangea to it, so by the time it's done, it's going to be a little more filled out. So back to those hydrangea blobs. Recall we made those earlier. I'm going to actually elevate this so I can see this a little bit better at the level that it will be displayed. So I'm going to put it up on a styrofoam. And then this is simply a gluing process. Just make sure your shrub is in there straight. You could give it a little more drying time so it's not wobbling around, but we're going to move forward. I'm just going to do half of the shrub to give you an idea of how I do it. And the icing doesn't like to stick to the crumb always, the cookie crumb, so you may have to apply it twice. And I'm going to start just by arranging the little flower parts, and then we'll fill in all the gaps with a different shade of leaf that's a little bit different than the color of the topiary itself. So random is the key here. To help get underneath here, you could also decorate the orb completely independently of putting it in the pot and then plunge it in. So that's an option too. Just gets a little trickier to get under here, underneath, when it's already plunged into the pot, but I worked them either way. Sometimes doing it in the pot gives you a better sense of what the finished composition is going to look like, because you're arranging to the pot itself. Okay, so that's just basically the front, and you would just repeat the process around the back. I'm not going to belabor that because I think you get the idea. I'm just going to put one more blob here, and then we're going to fill in the gaps with some dark green leaves, just for a little bit of distinction from the moss green underneath. This is a leaf green with a little bit of black in it. And I've got a number 349 tip. Every tip numbering system is a little bit different, so my Atikos are different than my Wiltons and so on. You just want to choose a tip that's the right size for your project at hand. And I think if I don't apply a lot of pressure to this tip, I'm going to get some dainty leaves. If I apply too much, I'll get a much bigger leaf than I need. So I'm hardly applying pressure here. Again, using a relatively thick icing that holds its shape. And I'm just putting these in at odd angles, different angles to fill in some of the gaps. And you don't have to fill them all either, because you want some of that moss green showing through for texture and variation. So I think I've filled out the front of that hydrangea rather nicely. I just complete that process around the back side. Actually, I do all the flowers first and then all the leaves. But that's the basic process. Now we'd set that aside to dry, and it would be time to assemble these on a cookie of some form. And just to give you an idea of that, we've got the brick walkway from earlier. We've got another recently completed hydrangea shrub. You could anchor that down with a little bit of glue, or you can leave these freestanding until you've decided exactly where you want them, or to allow more mobility. If you're doing a whole cookiescape and table display, you might want to keep them completely freestanding so that you can design your tablescape until the very end, and so that people can pull them off and just grab them as individual cookie components. So here's that miniature little beauty in single cookie form. You can of course take this up several notches all the way to my cookie arbor, which, if you haven't seen that video, I do encourage you to jump on over there. I posted it last week. It uses all of these elements and more to create a tremendous show-stopping centerpiece that's perfect for a summer garden party or wedding. Till next video, live sweetly.